My daughter set the papers on the kitchen table like she was doing me a favor. "It's a good place, Mom," she said, smoothing the top sheet with one manicured hand. 12 acres, a pool, they have a music room. She paused, letting that land. She knew I used to teach piano. She was using it like a key she'd kept for years, waiting for the right lock. Dennis and I already put down the deposit. "All you need to do is sign." I looked at the papers, then I looked at her, then I picked up the pen. I signed. What my daughter didn't know was that I'd made a phone call 3 days earlier. What she didn't know was that I'd been expecting this conversation for 6 months, ever since I overheard her on the phone with her husband, telling him that the situation needed a permanent solution. I was the situation. I signed the papers she wanted me to sign. And then, while she was in the bathroom refreshing her lipstick, I slid my own set of documents from beneath the fruit bowl and signed those too, the ones my attorney had prepared, the ones that moved the remainder of my savings back into an account my daughter had never heard of. 2 days later, I was gone. I'd lived in my daughter's house for 4 months by then. I'd sold my own place in November. Her idea, practical she called it, why pay 2 mortgages, and moved my furniture into her basement and my body into the guest room with the yellow curtains that she never changed because she'd bought them for someone who no longer lived there. I cooked dinners no one thanked me for. I watched my grandchildren scroll through their phones at the table while my daughter talked about the cost of private school. And my son-in-law nodded at everything she said, like a man who had long since stopped having opinions of his own. I was not mistreated. That was the complicated part. There were no slammed doors, no cruel words, just the quiet, daily erasure of being treated like furniture, useful when needed, invisible otherwise. I taught piano for 31 years. I raised my daughter through her father's death when she was 16. I drove 4 hours every weekend the first year she was married because she said she was lonely. And now I was a situation that needed a permanent solution. The morning I left, I made coffee before anyone was up. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the backyard go gray in the early light. My carry-on was already by the side door. I'd packed it the previous Thursday while my daughter was at her book club. 3 changes of clothes, my medications sorted into a weekly pill organizer, my reading glasses, and a small envelope of cash I'd been setting aside since December. $40 a week, it added up. I didn't leave a note. I called a cab from the end of the driveway so the sound of tires on gravel wouldn't wake the house. The driver was a young man with headphones around his neck who asked me once where I was headed and then left me alone. I told him the train station. He nodded and drove. On the platform, I bought a coffee from a vending machine that tasted like warm metal, and I sat on a bench with my carry-on between my feet and watched the board flip. I wasn't running away. I want to be clear about that. I was walking toward something I should have reached years ago. I just hadn't known it needed walking toward until my own daughter set a nursing home brochure on the table and called it a gift. The train went north. I'd chosen Burlington, Vermont. I'd been there once in my 30s, with my husband, before my daughter was born. We'd eaten cheese and walked by the lake, and I'd said, "Someday I'd like to come back here." He'd smiled and said, "We will." We never did. He died at 58. That was 12 years ago. But the city was still somewhere in the back of my mind, warm and unfinished, like a sentence I'd never completed. I arrived at 2 in the afternoon. The station was modest, the kind that still had wooden benches and a woman behind a glass window who didn't look up when you came in. Outside, the air was cold and smelled like pine and river water. I stood on the sidewalk for a full minute, just breathing. I had done the math. Between my pension, my Social Security, which was still routing to my personal account, not the joint one my daughter had access to, and the money I'd quietly moved in the days before leaving, I had enough, not for luxury, but enough to start something real. I'd looked up the city before I left. Not obsessively, just carefully. I'd found a woman named Ruth who rented a room in her house near the old North End neighborhood. The listing said, "Quiet house, private bath, no drama, utilities included, prefer long-term." I'd called her from a payphone at the library near my daughter's house on a Tuesday, while my daughter thought I was returning library books. Ruth's voice was dry and precise. She asked my age. I told her. She asked if I was healthy. I said healthy enough to be inconvenient, which made her laugh, short and surprised. She said, "Come by if you want. No promises." I took a cab to her street. The house was narrow and deep green, with a wraparound porch and a wind vane shaped like a rooster. Ruth met me at the door. She was 74, I learned later, with short silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead at all times. She led me through a house that smelled like lemon polish and old books, up a staircase with a slight lean to the right, and opened a door at the end of the hall. The room had 2 windows facing east. There was a writing desk and a lamp, and a quilt folded at the foot of the bed, the kind made from old shirts and blouses that someone had taken the time to piece together by hand. I stood in the doorway and felt something shift in my chest. Not happiness exactly. Recognition, like a word you'd forgotten until you heard someone else say it. "I'll take it," I said. Ruth nodded. Month to month. Rent on the 1st. Kitchens shared. I cook at 6 if you want to join, but you don't have to. I just hate eating in front of the television like a person with no dignity. I said I felt exactly the same way. She handed me a key and told me the Wi-Fi password was the same as her late husband's favorite jazz album. I didn't ask which one. The first night, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the quiet hold me. No one was calling me for dinner. No one needed me to watch the kids. No one was saying "Mom" in that particular tone, the one that meant I need something and I'm already annoyed that I have to ask. I opened my pill organizer, took my evening medications, and read 17 pages of a novel I'd been trying to finish for 3 months. Then I turned off the light and slept until 7:30, without once waking up. In the morning, I walked. The neighborhood was old and unpolished in the way I liked. Painted porches, small gardens going dry at the end of the season, corner stores with hand-lettered signs. I found a bakery 4 blocks away that opened at 6 and smelled like butter and yeast from half a street away. I went in, ordered a plain coffee and a biscuit, and sat at the counter reading the local paper. The woman behind the counter was in her 50s, efficient and warm. Her name was Patrice. She remembered my order by the 3rd day without being asked. On the 4th morning, I noticed a card taped to the register. Looking for part-time help. Morning hours. Baking experience a plus, but not required. Must like people. I looked at it for a moment. Then I asked. Patrice tilted her head like she was calibrating something. 31 years of teaching piano. I can follow instructions and I don't call in for tired. She slid a fresh cup of coffee across the counter. Come in tomorrow at 5:30. We'll see how it goes. My hands remembered things my mind had forgotten. How to move efficiently in a small space. How to talk to people who haven't had their coffee yet in a way that doesn't aggravate them. I started on register and light prep. By the 2nd week, Patrice let me handle the morning pastry case. By the 3rd, she stopped watching me so closely and just worked beside me like we'd been doing it for years. It wasn't glamorous. My feet ached by 9. But there was something clarifying about work that showed you exactly what you'd done at the end of it. A clean counter. An empty pastry shelf. A line of people who'd come in tense and left a little softer. I hadn't turned my phone on in 12 days. When I finally did, on a Thursday evening while Ruth was watching a documentary about migratory birds, the messages came through like a tide. 17 from my daughter. 4 from my son-in-law. 3 from numbers I didn't recognize, probably the nursing home, I thought, wondering where their new resident had gone. My daughter's first message was practical. Mom, the facility is asking for your arrival date. Please call. Her second was irritated. Mom, this is not funny. The third was something closer to genuine, or as close as she could manage. Mom, where are you? Please, just tell me you're safe. I listened to all of them, standing by my window, looking at the street below. Then I set the phone face down on the desk. I wasn't ready to answer. Not because I wanted to punish her. I want to be honest about that. Silence was not a weapon. It was a door I needed to stay behind a little longer, until I was sure enough of who I was on this side of it that I wouldn't lose her again when I opened it. Ruth knocked on my door that night and held up a bottle of red wine and 2 mismatched glasses. I told her I'd just gotten 17 voicemails from my family, and she said, "Sounds like a 2-glass situation." We drank at the kitchen table, and she told me about the year her son moved her to a condo near his house in Maryland without asking first, and she'd moved back to Burlington 3 months later. He barely spoke to her for a year, she said. Now he calls every Sunday. Funny how people learn fastest when you stop making it easy for them not to. I told her about the nursing home papers, about the fruit bowl, about driving away in a cab while my daughter slept. Ruth poured me more wine. "You signed your own papers first?" "I did." She raised her glass. Sensible woman. There was a man who came into the bakery every weekday at 7:15 named Gerald. He was 70. A retired architect, a widower of 3 years. He always ordered a large coffee and one of the almond croissants, and he always read a physical newspaper, which Patrice said made him one of about 4 people in the state who still did. We started talking the way people do when they're in the same place at the same time, often enough that talking becomes easier than not. He didn't ask intrusive questions. He asked interesting ones. What was the first piece of music you ever loved? If you could live in any decade you didn't live through, which one? He was the kind of man who'd learned how to listen somewhere along the way and decided it was worth continuing. One morning, he brought me a small card from a bulletin board downtown. Community choir. Open to all ages and abilities. Thursdays at 7. I played piano for 30 years, I told him. I never sang. He said, "Maybe that's why." I went on a Thursday. The director was a woman my age named Sylvia, who wore statement earrings and tolerated no self-consciousness. She handed me sheet music and put me in the altos, and by the second hour I had forgotten to worry about whether I was doing it correctly. My voice wasn't remarkable, but it was mine, and I hadn't used it in a long time for anything other than being agreeable. I started going every week. The call from my grandson came on a Sunday morning in early November. He was 23, studying environmental science on the other side of the country, and he was the only one who had thought to try calling the number from the old address book my daughter kept in the kitchen drawer, the one with my attorney's office listed under E, for Eleanor, my name, not Mom, not Grandma. He'd called my attorney. My attorney had confirmed I was alive and well and represented, and that was all she could share. My grandson had, apparently, found this more reassuring than alarming. "Grandma," he said when I picked up. His voice was careful, warm. "You okay?" "Better than I've been in a long time." A long exhale. "Okay. Good. Okay, good." He didn't demand explanations. He didn't list everything my daughter was going through. He asked what the weather was like, and I told him it had snowed 2 inches the night before, and that I'd walked to the bakery in the dark, with the snow coming down and the street completely still, and it had been one of the most beautiful mornings I could remember. He said that sounded like something you'd write a poem about. I said maybe I would. We talked for 40 minutes. He told me about a project he was doing on watershed restoration. I told him about the choir. He said, "You sing now?" I said I was learning to. He said, "Grandma, that's genuinely cool." I did not cry, but my throat was full by the time we said goodbye. My daughter's letter arrived 10 days later. Ruth handed it to me without comment, which was one of the many things I'd come to appreciate about her. The letter was 4 pages. Long, composed, thorough, She'd always been thorough. She described the disruption I'd caused, the embarrassment of explaining to the nursing home that their new resident had simply not arrived, the conversations she'd had with my son-in-law, with her friends, with a therapist she'd apparently started seeing, which surprised me. She said I had blindsided her. She said she had only been trying to help. She said the house was getting to be too much, and they'd needed a solution. Didn't I understand that? Didn't I see how hard they were trying to manage everything? Not once in 4 pages did she say she missed me. I read the letter twice. Then I put it back in the envelope and slid it under my mattress. Not out of sentiment, out of documentation. My attorney had advised me to keep a record. The following week, a man in a wool coat came into the bakery 10 minutes before closing and asked for Eleanor Marsh. Patrice looked at me. I came around from behind the counter. He introduced himself as a representative of my daughter's family, which was a peculiar way to describe her, but I let it go. He said they were concerned about my well-being and would like to know that I was in a stable living situation with access to my medical care. I told him I had a private room, a doctor I'd already seen twice, a part-time job, and a social life that was frankly more active than it had been in a decade. He wrote something in a small notebook. I asked him if he was done. He said he'd need to report back. I said, "Report whatever you like. I'm not a missing person. I'm a person who left." I walked back behind the counter and finished closing down the pastry case. Patrice handed me my coat without a word. But when the man had gone, she said, "I've been waiting for someone to talk to one of them like that since 2019. I asked who from 2019. She said, "Different situation, same type of man." That night, Gerald and I walked along the waterfront after the choir rehearsal had ended. It was cold enough that our breath came out in visible puffs. He asked how I was really doing, the way certain people know how to ask, where it's clear they actually want to know. I told him the truth. That it was strange to feel this light at 68, that I'd spent so much of the last several years contorting myself into a shape my daughter found manageable that I'd forgotten I had a shape of my own. That Portland, Vermont still felt a little unreal, like a life that belonged to someone else and I was borrowing it temporarily. Except that every morning it felt a little more like mine. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think the places we choose for ourselves always feel borrowed. At first, you have to keep showing up until you feel entitled to them." I thought about that for a long time after he said it. I wrote my daughter back on a Tuesday. 1 page, careful and honest. I told her I understood that she'd been overwhelmed. I told her that what she'd planned was not a solution, but an erasure, and that she may not have meant it that way, but that was how it had landed. I told her I had retained an attorney and that my finances were in order and would remain entirely under my control going forward. I told her I was not angry. I told her I was done. That last part I reread 3 times before I sealed the envelope. Done did not mean I never wanted to see her again. It meant I was done waiting for her to see me as a person rather than a variable in her household equation. If she ever wanted to find her way to actually knowing me, I would be here. But I was not going to wait in a room with yellow curtains for something she might never offer. I mailed it with a stamp that had a mountain on it. Vermont issue. It seemed right. My daughter called 6 days after that. I let it ring the first time. The second time, I answered. She was quiet for a moment after I said hello. Then she said, "I read your letter." I know. She didn't say she was sorry. I hadn't expected her to. What she said was, "I didn't think of it as erasing you. I thought of it as practical." "I know that too," I said. Silence. "I want to see you," she finally said. I sat with that for a moment. There was a version of me that would have said, "Of course. Whenever you want. What time works for you?" That version had lived in a guest room with yellow curtains and eaten dinners that no one thanked her for. I let that version sit quietly where she was. Not yet, I said. I need a little more time. When I'm ready, I'll call. She made a sound that was not quite a word. Then she said, Okay. That was more than I'd expected. I told her so. She said she'd been working on it. We hung up without warmth, but without coldness either. Somewhere in between, in the register where honesty lives when it's new and uncertain. It was February when my grandson came to Burlington. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. He showed up at the bakery on a Saturday morning in a parka and a backpack, and Patrice pointed at me without him having to ask. He stood at the counter with his hands in his pockets, and I saw that he was nervous, which moved me because there was no reason for him to be nervous with me, and the fact that he was anyway meant he was taking this seriously. I came around the counter and hugged him. He was taller than I'd registered over the phone. He smelled like coffee and cold air. We spent the day walking. I showed him the bakery, Ruth Street, the waterfront where Gerald and I had walked. We ate lunch at a diner with red booths and mediocre coffee, and he didn't complain once. He told me about his thesis. I told him about the choir. At one point he said, Do you ever think about coming back? I thought about it for a real moment, not a polite one. Not to what it was, I said. But maybe someday I'll visit, see where everyone's gotten to. He nodded. He understood the difference, I think, between the place and the condition. He was smart that way. He'd always been smart that way, even as a child. He was the one who used to sit beside me at the piano not because he wanted to learn, but because he said the sound made him feel less restless. I'd always loved him for that. Before he left, he gave me something from his backpack. A small, framed photograph I hadn't seen in 20 years. My husband and me on a lake somewhere, both of us laughing at something out of frame. He must have found it in whatever my daughter had packed up from my old house. Where did you get this? I asked. Mom's storage. I looked through some boxes. I thought you should have it. I stood there holding it with both hands. Outside, snow was beginning again, soft and without urgency. Thank you, I said. He hugged me once more before his rideshare came. Long and quiet, the way his childhood hugs had always been not performative, just real. I stood on the sidewalk and watched the car pull away. Back inside, Ruth was making soup. She looked at the photograph in my hand and then at my face and said nothing, just ladled 2 bowls and set them on the table. We ate in the easy silence of people who have said enough for one day. By spring, the choir was preparing for a small concert. Sylvia had given me a 2-bar solo in one of the pieces, which she presented as simply as if she were handing me a pencil. You've got a decent alto register, and you actually listen to the other sections, she said. That's rarer than you'd think. I practiced in my room in the evenings. Ruth could hear me through the floor, and she never complained, though once she called up, a little more breath on the 3rd line, which was either irritating or correct, and turned out to be both. Gerald came to the concert. He sat in the 3rd row, and when our section came in, he looked at me the way you look at someone when you see them as they actually are, not as you've decided they should be. It was a small thing. It was not small. Afterward, we walked along the same waterfront as before. The air was soft now, the lake still gray but no longer hostile. He asked if I was happy. I said I was something close to it. Something that felt more sustainable than happy. He said he thought that was probably better anyway. I said I was starting to think so too. My attorney sent a letter in April. Everything was settled. My accounts were clear. My daughter had stopped contesting, and there was no further legal contact expected. I read it in the kitchen over coffee, and then filed it in the folder I kept in the desk drawer and went to work. On a Wednesday in late April, I was setting out the morning pastries when a woman came in who stopped halfway through the door and stared at me. She was around my age, well-dressed, with the particular expression of someone who has just confirmed something they were hoping not to find. My daughter. She looked at the apron, at the pastry tongs in my hand, at the bakery around me, small and warm and mine. I looked back at her. Patrice appeared from the kitchen, read the room in approximately 1 second, and said, "I'll be out back if you need anything," and disappeared again. My daughter stepped fully inside. The door closed behind her. She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked around like she was cataloging everything. Then she looked at me. "You look different," she said. "I feel different." She sat down at the counter, not like she owned the place, but like she'd accepted she was a visitor. I poured her a coffee without asking. She wrapped both hands around the mug. "I wanted to see if it was real," she said. "It's real." She was quiet. I let her be. I went back to arranging the pastry case, working slowly, giving her time to say whatever she'd come to say. Finally, "I didn't know you were lonely." I set down the tongs. I turned around. "That's the thing," I said. "I wasn't lonely before. I was erased. There's a difference." She looked at the table. Her jaw tightened the way it always did when she was trying not to cry, that same reflex she'd had since she was a teenager. I had not stopped knowing her, even when I'd stopped waiting for her. "I was scared," she said, "of what you needed, of what it would mean for us. I know. I could have talked to you." "Yes." The word landed quietly between us, not as an accusation, just as the fact it was. She looked up. "I don't know how to do this better," she said, "but I want to try." I sat down across from her. We were not going to fix it today. We were not going to fix it fast. 30 years of a particular shape doesn't change because someone drives to Vermont and orders a coffee. But she was here. She had come. And that was not nothing. "You can start by asking me things," I said. "Not assuming, asking." She nodded slowly. "What do you want to know about my life here?" She looked around the bakery. The worn wooden counter, the chalkboard menu, the morning light coming through the window at a flat, clear angle. "Everything," she said. "I guess everything." So I told her. I told her about Ruth and the croissants, and the night we drank wine, and she told me about Maryland. I told her about the choir and the two-bar solo, about Gerald, carefully and without too much, because some things you hold close until you're sure of them. About the morning I'd arrived and stood on the sidewalk, breathing pine and river water, and thought, this will do. This will more than do. She listened. She didn't interrupt. When the bakery started to fill up, she moved to a corner table and kept listening while I worked, watching me the way you watch someone you've been underestimating for long enough that the correction takes time. She left at noon. We hugged on the sidewalk, briefly, the hug of two people who are finding the coordinates of each other again after being lost. She said she'd call. I said I'd pick up. That was true. I would. Not because everything was mended, not because the nursing home brochure had unlanded on the table, but because she was my daughter, and I was still her mother, and some threads, even the ones that fray terribly, are worth the careful work of reweaving, on my terms this time. In my time, from this city I had chosen with my own hands, in this apron Patrice had given me, in this life that had opened up like a window I'd been standing in front of for years without realizing I was allowed to push it. That evening, Ruth and I sat on the porch while the light faded over the neighborhood. Franklin, her neighbor's cat, who had adopted us by increments, was curled between our chairs. The wind chimes her late husband had hung at the corner of the porch 30 years ago made their small, steady sound. She came, Ruth said. She came. And? We'll see, I said. Ruth nodded and poured herself more tea. That's the right answer. Later, alone in my room, I sat at the writing desk and opened the small journal I'd started when I arrived. I wrote, "Today she came." And I poured her coffee. And we talked like two people who were still learning to be honest with each other. It was not dramatic. It was not a resolution. But it was a beginning. And I have learned by now that beginnings are quiet things. They don't announce themselves. You only recognize them looking back. I closed the journal. Outside, the street was dark and still. The lamp on the desk was warm against the wall. Tomorrow I would walk to the bakery in the early dark. I would open the pastry case and remember the orders and pour coffee for people who needed it. Gerald would come at 7:15 with his newspaper. On Thursday, I would sing in the choir and hit the third line with more breath like Sylvia kept telling me to. On Saturday, I would call my grandson and tell him his mother had come, and he would say, "How was it?" And I would say, "It was a start." I was 68 years old. I had sold a house and lost a guest room and found a narrow house with a leaning staircase and a rooster wind vane. I had learned to bake and found a choir and made a friend who told me when my breath was wrong and another who asked me questions worth answering. I had signed my own name at the bottom of my own life and meant it this time. I was not waiting for anyone to come back for me. I was already exactly where I needed to be. If you've ever sat in a room that wasn't really yours and wondered if it was too late to find one that was, it isn't. It's not too late. You just have to be willing to stop waiting for permission. The door is usually right there. You were always the one holding the key.